All right, we are in week 3 of our relationship series. I'm glad you're with us, and we're going to be continuing our series that we're looking at dealing with the crap in our relationships and finding a way forward. That's what we've been talking about all this month. And there's just with maybe you're married, maybe you're dating, maybe you're thinking about friends or family. And all the relationships we have, there can just be these moments where it's hard. There's maybe some crap because of our own mistakes or their mistakes that kind of sets in. So we want to deal with all of that so we can find a way forward. And so the last couple of weeks, first week of the series, we talked about anger and bitterness, and we talked about how God calls us to forgive as he's forgiven us, and how if we hold bitterness against other people, it ends up just dragging us down. We looked at our society and how angry it is, and we just talked about a way forward to clothe ourselves with the things of God. And so last week we talked about our words, whether that is language that's called filthy in the Bible and that tears other people down, or lying, or slander and gossip. We talked about ridding ourselves of those type of things, but sharing words that build others up, to share words of wisdom with other people. And so last week we had this challenge to be grateful for other people, to share words that build them up, to tell someone every day, tell one person every day to say, I'm thankful for you because, and then kind of fill in the blank for that person. I don't know if you did that or not. I know I did that most of the days this week, and it was pretty cool, and I think it was encouraging for people. And so if you didn't do that, you can try again this week. Like, we're a church of second chances, and so if you forgot last week, maybe try again this week. It's Valentine's weekend. Maybe this is another chance to maybe say something nice to the person you're with and stuff like that. So maybe that's a chance to do that. So today we're continuing the series, and throughout this whole series, we're talking about Colossians chapter 3 in the Bible. So we're going to be looking at that. If you got a Bible with you, it's about kind of 3/4 of the way in the back of the Bible. And if you don't have a Bible, always encourage you to check out the YouVersion Bible app. You can follow along today. There is a Bible reading plan we've been doing for each week of this series. So the new one will be posted later this afternoon. It will go along with what we talk about today. And so I encourage you to check that out, and you can follow along today. This is a great opportunity to take what we talk about on Sundays and to reflect more about it. And we read the Bible so we get to know God and his ways, so he can guide us in our life. And I hope that can happen for you. But you got to take those steps. And so this is one way we can do that together. So let's look in Colossians 3 together. Beginning in verse 5, we've been looking at this passage all month long. Here's what it says: Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to the earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming. And you used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge of the image of its creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another as if anyone has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. And let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing with gratitude to God with gratitude in your hearts. That's been our passage all month long, and we've been kind of focusing in on one specific verse. And at the end there it mentioned some songs, and this was Valentine's weekend, and maybe you have a significant other, maybe you don't, but I don't know if you've ever had this is our song. Have you guys ever had that? And maybe it's Elton John, you can tell everyone this is your song, but maybe as a couple you have a song. It doesn't seem to work that way these days, but back in the day you'd have this is our song. Maybe it was your first dance, maybe it was a song from your wedding, something like that. And back in the day, you used to go to a place and they'd have a jukebox and you'd throw a quarter in there and you'd play your song and it'd be this special moment. And Maybe it might have even been like at Pizza Hut. That's what I think of. When I think of jukebox, I think Pizza Hut with the red plastic cups, the checkered tablecloths, and you'd go play a round of Pac-Man, and you'd throw a quarter in the jukebox, and you'd play a song. And some of you are like, I don't even know what a jukebox is. And that's okay. Things are different these days. I get that. But that's how it used to be, and you'd play your song. But nowadays, relationships are just different. And even songs are different. It's just the whole dating and relationships isn't the same as it used to be. And so the love songs are different too. And I saw this artist, his name is John Mark McMillan. He actually wrote a song that we sing at church sometimes called How He Loves. And I follow him on TikTok, and he was sharing about an observation that I thought was really interesting. So let's check that out right now.
Have you noticed how there are like no love songs on the radio anymore? Well, maybe one or two, but not like in years past where the dominant theme has been love. I mean, I think if you collected all the popular songs of the past 100 years, I bet like 85% of them would be love songs, but not anymore. We have songs about sex and we have songs about anger, but not a whole lot of songs about love. And it's a little concerning because what you hear on popular radio usually reflects popular culture. Is it becoming unpopular to be in love? Do we not love anymore?
I think that was an interesting thought, to think that there's songs about anger and there's songs about sex, but there's not a whole lot of songs about love. And I wonder if those two emotions actually end up playing together as an effect of each other. Today, as we think about that passage we've been talking about, we're looking at the very first verse. Let's go back to Colossians chapter 3. It says, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." Today, we're talking about sexuality. We're talking about sex. Because if there's one thing that can bring a lot of crap into our lives, it's this. This is one thing that can bring major crap to our life. It's consequences that last for years, maybe even a lifetime. And so throughout this series, we've been talking about these different things, and today might even seem maybe a little more personal. And I want you to know that as we talk about this, like no one is judging you. We don't want you to feel shame about this. I don't want you to feel that way. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone, but I believe that God has a better way forward for us. And so we're going to talk about this just like we talked about lying and anger and slander and other things that we're going to be talking about this next couple of weeks, because these are all issues that can bring crap into our life. So just know there's no judgment. This is what we hope that you can find a way forward in your life and relationships, because this is a big issue. And so we're going to be talking about it because this is what the Bible shares, and I've just seen the effect of this in people's lives. Notice the first couple words of this verse. It says, "Put it to death." That's like pretty serious language, right? This isn't like, hey, don't mess around with this. This is like, hey, put this to death. In other parts of the Bible that we're going to read later, it says to even like flee, to like run away, like don't even mess around with this, because this is an issue that can just really mess up our life and our relationships. And as we're thinking about like sexuality and things of this, as we're going to look in the Bible at different things, you might feel like what's the big deal? Like this is like, why is this such an issue? Or you might feel like we're going to look in the Bible for this. Isn't the Bible a little outdated when it comes to this idea? When it comes to sexuality, isn't the Bible a little outdated? Like we're in this progressive modern age. Well, actually, the Bible has a lot to say about it. And if you look at what was happening in the Bible times, it's probably a lot different than what you might think or imagine. We tend to think about like the Bible times, and we think about like, oh, there was these people and they just wore robes, and they just, they were like a long time ago, they just kind of streamed the fields with their sheep and everything was nice and pleasant. But that is so far from what is happening. It was actually a very violent and a very different age than what we often picture. In fact, if you look in Leviticus 18, God is giving like Moses these rules to pass on to the people of Israel. And what they're doing is the nation of Israel was in slavery, and they had no kind of governing laws or rules for their society. And as they were becoming their own society, God said, here's some rules like the Ten Commandments and these other things. In Leviticus 18, he talks about God instructed Moses to tell the people to not have sex with close relatives, with siblings, parents, or the other wives of their fathers, because their fathers would have multiple wives, not to have sex with animals. Like they had to tell them, don't do those things because they were doing those type of things. And you think of like when the nation of Israel was going into the promised land, it was just the land of Canaan, the Canaanites that lived there. They had all of these practices, and they would follow these different gods like Baal, and they would have these different practices for their religion, even like child sacrifice and brutal things like that. But one of the things they had was temple prostitutes. And so you could go to your religious temple and you could have this temple prostitute as part of their thing. In fact, some places, including Colossae, which Paul wrote this letter to, the city of Colossae, they would have these different temples and religions of foreign gods that they would follow, and they would end up, as part of their religious ceremonies, they would have a big orgy. And so when we looked at this in the first week, Paul was saying, like, watch these outside influences. Don't let these other influences happen in our life. This was one of the things he was warning them about. Jesus walked the earth, and we see a lot of the New Testament was during the Roman age. And if you know anything about the Roman age, it was the age of promiscuity and sexual exploration, and it was just kind of out there. And so as you think about the Bible times, you might not even picture those things, but we might think, I'm so progressive today. Well, the Bible time actually was a lot worse than what it was today. And so we have to remember that as we're taking this into context. And so the Bible actually has a lot of good to say about it. And there's also some examples for us to not follow. We're talking today about all the crap that can come into our life when we don't follow God's ways of sexuality. We see people in the Bible where that happened to. There was a guy named Samson, and maybe you know the story, maybe you don't. There's Samson and Delilah. His lust for women overtook all of his decisions, and it cost him everything, including his life. We see people like David and Bathsheba, where David saw his neighbor's wife naked, and he, instead of turning away, he engaged in those thoughts that he shouldn't have. He ends up sleeping with his neighbor's wife. She ends up getting pregnant. He ends up having to tell all these lies about it. It just snowballs and snowballs, where he eventually actually even sets his neighbor Uriah, who is the leader of his army, up for murder. And it just kind of snowballed. And so we see those stories as like warnings for us in the scriptures to like saying there's a better way. And we need to consider God's ways when it comes to sexuality. And the struggles nowadays might be different, but they're still struggles. And there's harder struggles. There's things like pornography, which is so accessible these days. And it's an issue not just for guys, where it might be more of an issue for guys, but the female use of pornography has skyrocketed, and it's addictive, and it can cause so many issues in our relationships. So we have issues like that. We have the issue of where sexuality these days is just treated as a casual thing. You just hook up with people. You have friends with benefits. It's this thing where it's just treated casually. And so things are just different these days. But what is the same is this, is that people often trade a moment of pleasure for an after effect of shame and regret and guilt. That hasn't gone away. People end up feeling abused and hurt. And so we talk about this because we don't want the crap in our relationships. And while society says, what's the big deal? It is a big deal because it can affect your whole life. And so as we look at that verse again, let's go back to that verse. It says again, put this to death. Like, don't mess around with this. Whatever belongs to, it says sexual immorality, and it says impurity and lust and evil desires. And like those things seem to kind of like all go together, right? But then it says, and greed. Like, why is that in there? And then it says it's idolatry. Well, there's another passage in 1 John chapter 2. It says this, for everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life come not from the Father, but from the world. The lust of the flesh, we see like using our bodies for acts of sin and saying, I want to have this and I'm going to like consume this in my body. The lust of the eyes is seeing something, whether that is a person or a thing, and saying, I must have that thing, or I'm going to lust upon this thing for my own pleasure. The pride of life is saying, this life is all about me, whatever makes me happy. I'm going to do whatever I want to do for my own pleasure. And so you can see how those things all play together. And so if we go back to that verse in Colossians, when it says greed there, it's talking about consuming things, seeing things that I want to have that for my pleasure. It might be like, oh, your neighbor's car, you're coveting after your neighbor's car. It might be a person. I see that person and I desire them, and so I'm going to lust upon them. I want to consume that person in a sense for my own pleasure. And when we go back to that verse in Colossians, it talks about at the end where that's idolatry. See, what this all comes down to is this worship. Am I going to worship God and follow his ways? Or is my life going to be like the pride of life, where it's all about me and my pleasure and what makes me happy? Are we going to live that way, or are we going to trust in God? See, what happens is that when we begin to go down that road, it might seem innocent at first. It might not seem like a big deal, but all of these things start to snowball upon each other, just like it did with David, where a simple act of the lust of the eyes, of looking at something we shouldn't, can turn into severe consequences like it did with David. I heard this quote. It says this. It says, sin will take us further than you want to go. It will keep you longer than you want to stay, and it will cost you more than what you want to pay. And that is true with all of the sin, but even more so, I think, with sexual sin. You'll end up going further than you want to go. It'll keep you longer. You'll be stuck with these consequences, and it'll cost you more than you want to pay. And this is why we talk about this stuff, because we want to deal with this crap in our life. We don't want it to consume us. But if we don't want this crap to consume us, we can't live with this, I'm going to consume people. So again, that verse talks about like this idea of sexual immorality, along with impurity, with lust, with evil desires and greed. It's all of this concept of I'm going to see other people as ways for my own pleasure. I'm going to consume objects and things and people, whether it's the way I look at them or the acts of sexuality. We heard John Mark McMullen talk about how culture these days has these songs, and it's all about stuff like what someone can give me, how they can meet my desires. And when we live like that, it's this idea of like consuming people. When my sexuality just becomes something that I'm going to do just for my own pleasure, and I'm going to start to treat other people as people who can give me pleasure, it changes the way that we see people. It changes the way that we see ourselves. It changes our own self-image. Our value starts to become something of what people see in how I can give them pleasure. And it just leaves us with this emptiness. What I have seen is that people who go down this path, what happens is they end up feeling empty on the inside because they've either been used and abused, or the thing they have just gone through so many partners that it really doesn't satisfy the desires that they were hoping it would. It just leaves them empty. Just leaves them empty. There's a better way. There's a way forward in all of this. And even things like pornography too, like that's the lust of the eyes. It's the evil desires. We can think like, what's the big deal? I'm just looking. Just because I'm not going to order off the menu doesn't mean I can't look at it, right? It's like pornography or how we even just view other people. But it just begins to snowball effect. And so we want to watch what we see and how we see other people. See, when it comes to like things like that, we have to remember that the person that we're looking at as a piece of meat, basically, for our own pleasure, they're someone else's sister or daughter. More importantly, they're someone who has been made in the image of God and someone who has value to God, and we're treating them like a piece of meat. And we're called to live differently, to see people differently. And maybe you're like, okay, I'm not going to just consume people, but what's the big deal if I just like sleep around a little bit? Or maybe like we're in love, right? And so Like, what's the big deal? I've heard people say this, like, I wouldn't buy a car without taking it for a test drive. So, like, I thought we could just, like, try it out, right? Well, you can, and it might work out. But most times, like, what if you try out a car and you're like, I don't really like that car? Like, you get rid of it, right? Like, what about with someone you're dating? You're like, I'm going to try it out. You're just going to try it out, and then you're not going to be committed to that, and you're just going to kind of just be like, I'm done with that. Or maybe you do take it for a test drive. Does that mean that you're going to make an investment in this vehicle, this person? So maybe you're going to take it for a test drive, but then does that mean, like, I'm just going to sign up for a lease, and a couple years down the road, I'll be done with that? Or does that mean even like you buy it, and then what happens when that model gets a little worn down, right? You're like, time for a new model? This is what statistics show, that people who live together and sleep together before marriage are more likely to get divorced, because it's really a pattern of our past history playing out for our future. Our past behavior is the best thing to show us what future behavior would be. So if you're someone who likes to test it out a little bit, that means down the road, you're probably going to be that same type of person who's going to test it out a little bit. If you're someone who has had multiple partners, down the road, you're going to be someone who has multiple partners. Again, this is where all of the crap comes in. And so this is why God says there's a better way forward. God designed sex to be within a marriage of a husband and a wife. It says this in Genesis chapter 2. He says, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. The two become one flesh. We see this all throughout Scripture, this idea of one flesh. God designed marriage. He created Adam and Eve. He designed the act of sex to consummate a marriage. That is what is, in God's eyes, this is what makes a marriage, is when people unite together physically. One flesh. It's two becoming one. Jesus talked about this, Matthew 19. He said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. See, in Jesus' eyes here, he says, when two people become one, then they're married. So let's not be separate. This shouldn't be separate. See, what happens is that God designed sex in such a way that when you come together physically, it's not just coming together physically. It's coming together biologically. There's endorphins that are released in your body that cause more attraction to that person. There's a piece of you that is given to that person when you come together physically, because two become one. It is a personal, it is a spiritual, it is a physical, a biological act. And God created more than just a physical situation. It's designed to be two people becoming one. And it even goes beyond that. Ephesians chapter 5, it says this, verse 31. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. See that again? And then it says, it's talking about like marriage and all this stuff in this passage. And then all of a sudden it says, but this is a profound mystery. I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. All of a sudden it talks about like Christ and the church. See, the union of two people becoming one is really supposed to be a symbol of our relationship with God. The marriage is supposed to be a symbol of our relationship with God. It's supposed to be a symbol of us becoming one with God in his spirit. It's really a reflection of that. And so this is supposed to be a special thing. And so we see this also in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. It says this, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the member of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Now, when it says prostitute, like back then, like you didn't just like sleep around. If you were having casual sex back then it was with prostitute. Like nowadays, that's not as common. Back then, there were prostitutes in the street. There were prostitutes at those other religious temples of foreign gods. You might even own a sex slave in a sense back then, and that would be like your own personal prostitute. And so this was a more common thing. That term. The term there isn't about prostitute. It's about uniting yourself with someone else that you're not married to. Would we do that if we're members of Christ? He says never. Do you not know that when you unite yourself with a prostitute or anyone, if you become one with her in body, for it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. See, here again, we see this is supposed to be a symbol of something sacred, of our union with God as well. So it says, flee from sexual immorality, put it to death, run away from it, don't mess around with this. Why? Here's another reason. All other sins a person commits are outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you've received from God? You are not your own, so don't live with this idea of the pride of life. I'm just going to live for my own pleasure, for my own happiness. Don't live that way. You're not your own. You're bought with a price. Honor God with your body. So you can say, what's the big deal, man? Everyone does this. This is part of society. What's the big deal? But here it says, when you sin sexually, you sin against your own body. This is different than other sins where consequences are bigger and heavier. They last with us longer. They stick around. They bring a lot of crap into our life and relationships, especially down the road. So you can say, like, what's the big deal? But the big deal is that when we sin against our own body, that means there's things like shame and regret, where you were maybe forced into doing something you weren't quite ready for or didn't want to go that far, but you're forced into it. There's this feelings of being used. There's feelings of emptiness, whether that's feeling used or just it doesn't bring you the satisfaction. Why is that? Because whenever you have sex with someone, a piece of you is given to them. It's two people becoming one. And when they're separate, when you just move on, a piece of you is torn apart because it's two becoming one. They're joined together. And a piece of you goes into that person. And so then you can feel, if you just keep walking in this path, you can feel empty, you can feel used. Even then maybe you say, I'm not going to do that anymore. You get married, but then even down the road, the consequences are still there because you have too many people in the bedroom. There's past memories, there's past struggles, there's past hurts, and all that comes into play. There's anger that sets in because you've been used or you feel empty, and all those things play together. So God says, will you trust him in this ways? That sex is designed for marriage, and within that concept, will we trust him? You see, like, this sin really plays out like with David, where it really has these effects that can last for so long and that can snowball. Whether it's anger or bitterness or lying or slander or all of these other things we talked about, this one is no different. We can't mess around with it because it's going to bring crap into our life. And you can say, what's the big deal? Like, we did it this way and it worked out fine. That might be true for you, but maybe you just haven't had the consequences yet. You know, I told lies to my parents. I didn't tell them all the truth. I didn't get caught, so the consequences weren't there. But I'm not going to keep walking in those ways because I know I can get in trouble. And this is the same thing where it can cause so much trouble down the line. You see, no one wakes up one morning and thinks, you know what, today I'm going to do something different. I'm going to go have an affair. Like, no one does that. It's small decisions in the wrong direction. It begins with maybe looking at pornography or something you shouldn't be looking at. It begins with a small step of seeing that person at work and feeling some attraction, and then maybe dialing into that and flirting a little bit. You're like, hey, we're just having fun. We're just goofing around. It begins with maybe looking up a past flame on Facebook, maybe sending a message or looking at a message you shouldn't have. It's these small steps of how we see things, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, thinking like I'm not happy or this, I'm not having enough pleasure. The pride of life that leads to the lust of the flesh and these consequences that come with it. Small steps in the wrong direction can cost us everything. And so this is why it's so important. So what conclusions do we come to on this? Well, one is this. If you feel like you've messed it up in the past, I want you to know, again, this is not supposed to be a morning of judgment where you feel judged or there's just more shame and guilt thrown upon you. I want you to know that God still loves you, that God cares about you, that he doesn't see you for your sinful acts, that you can find forgiveness and he can see you as clean and new again. You might still have some consequences from your past decisions, but there's still forgiveness. And his perfect love can drive out the shame and the guilt. I want you to know that if that's been you, you can always pursue him in that. And so there is a better way forward and to walk in his ways. I want you to know this too, that God created sex for marriage. There's actually this passage in the Bible called Song of Solomon. It's a whole book of the Bible. And I remember when I was a teenage boy and I came upon that, I was like, this is in the Bible? Because God wants us to celebrate this. This is a thing to celebrate within the context of marriage. So if you're married, enjoy it together. Be one together. It's a way that God designed for pleasure for a couple, but also of closer connection. And so it's Valentine's weekend, like be with each other, celebrate that. We've been talking a lot about the Sabbath. There's like these old records that show like one of the practices they did on the Sabbath was make love to their spouse. Great plan. And the scriptures say that it's good for us to do within this context, that sex is not a bad thing. It's a great thing designed for marriage. And when we go outside of that, that's when it can cause all the problems. So it says to married couples in the Bible, it says, don't hold it from each other for long periods of time because it can cause unnecessary temptation. And so for us as couples who are married, we need to put down our phones. We need to dial into each other. We need to work on all of those non-physical things to love each other better that way. So this can be a physical thing that can work together too, because all of those things play together. We're going to talk a little more about that next week. And in this passage in Colossians 3:2, there has been kind of the first part of the passage was all like, get rid of all these things. And the second part was like here's the things you should do. And it begins with these words. It says, clothe yourself in the second part. Maybe we just need to stop there. Just keep your clothes on. If you're not married, keep those clothes on. Maybe, if you are looking to draw attention physically from the opposite sex, maybe you're drawing the wrong type of people. And we've talked about that before. And we want to attract the people that walk in God's ways. And if you want that for yourself, you got to walk that way yourself. And so also pornography, and we talked about that, the lust of the eyes, such a huge issue. And so I just want to show you this. There's this website. It's called XXX Church. Be careful when you type that in, xxxchurch.com. And make sure you don't click on the wrong things there. But this website is a great resource. It has software to help protect your devices. It has support groups, it has seminars, all kinds of resources to help you deal with pornography because it can become an addictive thing. And like I said, it's so accessible these days. This has become a bigger issue, not just for men, but for women as well. And so there's great resources on there that can really help you out and to deal with that and to safeguard yourself. So again, be careful when you type that in, but that's a great resource that you might want to check out as well. God intended sex to be a great part of our marriages. But sex can bring so much crap into our relationships when we don't do it his way. So this is the challenge, to walk in his ways, to not compromise, to not follow the pattern of this world, but to walk in God's ways. Because when we do, we can avoid that crap that comes with walking in the wrong ways. You used to walk in those ways, there's a better way forward, including with our sexuality. Let me just pray as we wrap this up. God, we thank you for your great love for us. We thank you for the gift of sex within marriage and how that can bring so much connection to our relationships. And we thank you for that gift. But we also know that it can be such a huge issue when we go outside of your ways, God. I pray for people who are here this morning, God, who have felt used and abused. I pray for the people who have felt like they've been treated like a piece of meat. I pray for those people who are struggling with shame and regret from their past. I pray that they can experience your forgiveness, God. I pray that they can experience a newness. I pray for those people who are struggling with the lust of the eyes, as they're maybe even addicted to pornography or things like that. I pray that they will seek help. I pray that you would help us keep our eyes pure, our hearts pure, God. I pray that we won't settle for this imitation of love, that we won't see other people as a piece of meat, as an object to consume, but we might see other people as people created in your image, God. I pray for our marriages, too, that we can maybe move past our past and find healthy way forward. I thank you, God, that you're a God of second chances. And I pray as we work through this that you will guide us, even in this way, God. Help us not to make the compromises. We look to you in your name. Amen. We're going to respond with a couple songs of God's love. Why don't you stand with us as we sing?